I brought a picture with me. Maybe you'll just have to imagine it. It's a picture of me with my son, Jonathan, when he was 6 months old. And it's one of my favorite pictures to remember back. It's hard for me to imagine that he was once 6 months old. Day after tomorrow, as a matter of fact, is going to be his 30th birthday, and I'm not really sure how that happened. I'm not able to do the math on that. And I love that picture. It's one that I pull out of my family albums because it reminds me of a pure kind of play that gets a little bit hard to recapture once kids start growing up. Any parents of young kids out there, you know what I'm talking about, right? I would lie him down on the couch, and I would take hold of his little hands and tickle his chest, and I would make those kinds of strange noises that adults only use with babies. You know, who knows what all of that means? And he would laugh and laugh and laugh with his whole being. And then we would stop. We would pause and sort of stare at each other for a few seconds. He's waiting for the game to continue. And then we'd keep going. We'd go off again. And he would laugh, and I would laugh until he tired of the game. And of course, that's the important part of it. I would have to watch his face and his body language to know when he was trying to communicate something to me. And he doesn't have words to be able to do that yet. When he's trying to tell me, okay, Dad, that's enough now. It's not fun anymore. Now, babies are perfectly capable of telling us this. Their facial expression changes. Sometimes they look away. They might even start to cry. And if you've ever seen it, it's heartbreaking to watch videos of parents who are just not getting it. They sort of intensify the tickling. They go at it more energetically. And what should have been a fun moment between parent and child, what should have been one of those pieces of a strong relationship, becomes more like torture for the child. And to the extent that interactions like that keep happening, the parent-child relationship is damaged, and the child's expectations of all relationships may be similarly colored. Now, why am I telling you this? And what does this have to do with Professor Brueggemann's proposal that we go astray if we interpret Old Testament law as merely a totalizing ideology, or we foreclose on the law in such a way that it becomes just a set of rules instead of an invitation into an ongoing and creative relationship, an invitation to pay attention and to listen. I am, by vocation, a family life educator, and part of what I do is I help people learn communication skills, help improve their relationships, and break the impasses in which they get stuck. And one side of that skills training, of course, is to help people learn how to say things in a way that's less likely to trigger somebody else's defensiveness. But I tend to emphasize the other side, the ability to listen well. Because all else being equal, even if everyone was very, very skilled at speaking, it wouldn't matter if no one listened. But if, on the other hand, everyone was able to listen well, and in particular, to be able to acknowledge and listen past their defenses, then even if a speaker was stumbling all over themselves to try to be heard, there could still be connection. Now, to be clear, I don't think listening is all about technique. As John Gottman has observed, what distinguishes stable and successful couples from the less successful ones is not that they all talk like therapists. It's really more about attitude than it is about technique. It's more about the willingness, even in the midst of conflict, to turn toward each other rather than away from each other, to even engage in those clumsy attempts to repair the relationship instead of rejecting or resenting one another. Now, for my own part, I still find it very valuable to teach communication skills to couples, even if you can't guarantee that they'll use them when they need them. But I don't think of that as a foolproof behavioral fix. Rather, the skills are ways for people to unlearn their ingrained habits of emotional reactivity, and to enable them to make more conscious and more conscientious choices about how they're going to behave in this moment, in this relationship. And all of that presupposes that they want to do better for their own sake and for the sake of the relationship. And so for the purposes of the minutes that we have together here, I want to make a distinction between listening skills and the underlying listening stance that a successful use of skills must presume. Because the listening stance is one of openness and expectation toward the other. And it's typically formed by the quality of care that children receive from their parents. And it has important implications for the real-world application of what Dr. Brueggemann has already proposed this morning. In brief, what I'm suggesting is that the moral core of neighborliness, the embrace of otherness in an attitude of openness and fidelity, has normative developmental roots in early family relationships, and that this has important implications for both practical ministry and for our shared narratives as a church. Psychological theories of moral development have often emphasized the more rational, reflective side of consciousness, as in Lawrence Kohlberg's studies of how children reason about moral dilemmas. People move through stages of development in which moral reasoning is first dominated by the anticipation of either pleasure or punishment, and then by rules and social norms, and then only after that by more abstract ethical principles. And of course, Kohlberg has had his critics, including Carol Gilligan, the social psychologist who criticized his notion of justice for being too Western and too individualistic and too male, and proposed instead a feminist alternative of an ethic grounded in compassion and care. Now, there have been, of course, more recent contributions which dig beneath the surface of debates like that, and the consequence of one of the most fruitful and, to me, fascinating lines of research has been to highlight the moral significance of emotional development. The moral significance of emotional development. And we could begin here with attachment theory. Considering the way that we understand parent-child relationships now, it's a little disturbing to think that as recently as the 1950s, the prevailing psychiatric assumption in many institutions was that babies only needed physical care to thrive. Just feed them, change them, give them a place to sleep, and they'll be fine. And we now know that that's far from true, has been evidenced by the many studies done with children who've grown up in Romanian orphanages more recently. Now, children need much more from their caregivers than just that kind of instrumental attention. They need social interaction with adults who are attuned to their emotions. Now, that word attunement may sound more esoteric than it really is. It's the kind of thing that so-called good enough parents almost take for granted, like knowing when to stop the tickle game, or knowing the difference between a hungry cry and a scared cry. And when parents respond appropriately to a child's distress, it helps the child calm down and over time to be able to regulate her own distress. And without that kind of synchronicity, babies may become accustomed to living in a chronic state of physiological stress with negative consequences for their physical health, their psychological health, and their emotional development. And John Bowlby, the originator of attachment theory, argued that babies then, on the basis of these experiences, form expectations of relationships. And he called these internal working models, or put differently, to borrow a phrase from Alison Gopnik, they develop theories of love. Babies who have experienced attuned care become securely attached to their caregivers. They've been loved well. They experience themselves as lovable, and they trust that they will be loved in the future. But children who receive consistently misattuned parenting, however, become insecurely attached. They still have to depend on their caregivers, but they don't trust that their cries for help are going to be answered appropriately, or sometimes even answered at all. Now, how do we know this? Developmental researchers would give just about anything for a few hours inside a baby's mind. They can't use the same kind of brain imaging techniques that we use for adults, and for some reason or another, babies just refuse to fill out questionnaires. Go figure. But there are other creative options. One is known as the habituation technique, and it goes like this. Babies are taking in sights and sounds from all around them all the time, but they tend to pay more attention to things that are more novel or unexpected. They look longer at it. And once they tire of the stimulus, once it's not novel anymore, they look away. So researchers can present babies with a variety of visual stimuli, and if they look longer at A than they look at B, then researchers infer that babies find A more interesting or more novel or more surprising, and from there they infer what it is that a baby expected to see, and therefore what they know. In 2007, Stanford researchers used that technique with 10 securely attached and 11 insecurely attached infants who were all of 12 to 16 months of age, and they showed them an animated video symbolizing a mother-child separation. And I say symbolizing because they didn't use real people. They had a big ellipse for the mother, and they had a small ellipse for the child. And in the video, the two ellipses appear at the same time, and the big ellipse, the mother ellipse, goes up the hill to a plateau and stays there. And when she does that, we'll say she for the sake of argument, the little ellipse starts pulsating and bouncing up and down, and you hear the sound of a real baby cry, right? And so they show this video to the babies over and over again, basically until they get bored with it and look away. And then the next phase begins. They show the babies two sequels to the original video in terms of how the mother then responds when the baby starts crying. In one sequel, the big ellipse goes back down the hill to the little ellipse, and in the other sequel, the mother keeps going up the hill, further away, and they watch and see what the children who are part of the study are actually going to do. And what the researchers found is that the securely attached infants stared significantly longer at the mother ellipse when it moved away. In other words, they were surprised by the lack of attention that the big ellipse gave to the little ellipse. And unfortunately, and sadly, the insecurely attached children tended to stare longer when the mother ellipse went back down the hill to the crying child, as if surprised at the mother's responsiveness to the child's distress. So even babies, it seems, make implicit theories of love. They build expectations of how their caregivers are going to respond to them when they're having a need. And those expectations color how they interpret new situations and new relationships. Now, children are capable of forming attachments with more than one adult, and one reliably secure attachment can cover a multitude of caregiving sins. Moreover, internal working models can be modified. In other words, our theories of love can be unlearned and relearned. But there is a clear normative expectation here that in order to thrive both physiologically and psychologically, babies need adults who care for them in sensitive and attuned ways. And this early and implicit emotional foundation has implications for their moral development as well. Now here I draw upon the work of Darcia Narvaez, a psychologist at Notre Dame, who has recently put forward what she calls a triune ethics theory. And that's not a theological commitment on her part. The name comes from Paul MacLean's triune brain theory, which posited three separate, though deeply interconnected parts of the brain. And what Narvaez has proposed is that there are three corresponding ethical orientations related to the dominance of brain states coming from each one of those three parts of MacLean's model. And she calls these, respectively, the safety ethic, the engagement ethic, and the imagination ethic. Let me describe each one of them in turn and then bring it back to the idea of a listening stance. Both humans and animals are hardwired with survival instincts, typically associated with the first and the most primitive of the three parts of the brain in MacLean's triune theory. Unless they're given reason to be afraid, the young of any species explore their environment and seek the things that they need. But of course, the environment isn't always safe, and threats will trigger instinctual reactions, like what we've heard of in terms of the fight or flight response, or even freezing or fainting. Now we have to remember that human babies in particular, for them, survival needs are not just physical, they're social. Parent-child relationships are a two-way street. Children are born needing and expecting the give and take of social interaction. Parents don't just woo their children. Children woo their parents into a relationship. And if children reach out socially and don't receive a trustworthy response, their survival needs are threatened. They need the attunement of their caregivers to soothe their distress, because without it, they remain in a state of dysregulation. What Narvaez proposes is that prolonged dysregulation, the kind associated with insecure attachment, leads to the predominance of what she calls a safety ethic, one that is driven by survival needs. Now, it's not too hard to imagine what moral forms this can take later in life. One may be prone to aggressive overreactions to perceived threats, constantly striving for status and dominance. One may automatically kowtow to authority out of fear. One may be loyal and protective towards one's in-group, but in ways that are really more about xenophobia than they are about love. And the more reactive one's survival systems, the more rigid or ruthless the safety ethic may become, shoving aside the more pro-social possibilities. Well, let's assume that a child actually has had the benefit of attuned parenting. Again, children are born with pro-social tendencies which will develop and flourish if not thwarted. That's why it's so important to play with our children, which, thank God, is much more fun than trying to get them to eat their vegetables. But responsive parenting is the basis of what Narvaez calls the engagement ethic, in which survival concerns have been satisfied, trust has been established, and children can move beyond an emotionally reactive and self-centered orientation. Attuned, responsive caregiving supports the healthy development of the limbic system, which is the second part in MacLean's triune theory. It sets the stage for a child's ability and desire to bond with and to care for others, including the moral emotions of openness and compassion and empathy. And finally, what Narvaez calls the imagination ethic is made possible by the maturation of the third and the last of MacLean's three parts of the brain. It is in the neocortex, and particularly in the frontal regions, that we can locate the development of the kind of reflective moral reasoning emphasized by Kohlberg's theory and others like it. And here I'm reminded of what these days has become an increasingly ubiquitous emphasis on mindfulness. It's not a matter of taking hot emotions and replacing them with cool reason, but of being able to notice one's emotional reactions, and to stand back and reflect on them, integrating them into a more deliberative thinking process. And with an imagination ethic, one can entertain possible actions based on moral principles and imagine the consequences. Without denying one's needs, one can also notice and consider the needs of others, sometimes deciding to act against instinct for the sake of higher principles. And so, speaking of imagination, many of you may be already imagining the implications of a theory like this for how one interprets and appropriates law or responds to situations of perceived injustice. As Dr. Brueggemann has suggested, it's not enough to have a one-dimensional view that imagines law to be a set of fixed rules that are just going to be applied to cases, as opposed to the performance of a relationship of trust, a relationship of fidelity, of loyalty. Let me push that idea just one small step further. Is it that we should understand moral development and morality itself as the application of rules to cases? Or as the performance of a relationship of trust and of loyalty and of fidelity? Now, I realize, of course, that I'm shifting the framework from the relationship between God and his people to the relationship between parents and children, but that's the point. Let me put it to you this way. The kind of neighborliness envisioned by Dr. Brueggemann's proposal, or for that matter, by the parable of the Good Samaritan, requires the imagination to see beyond our taken-for-granted in-group loyalties and the self-righteous and the self-protective interpretations that support them. But unfortunately, we simply can't assume that every child of God operates out of a robust engagement or imagination ethic. When God's law and current events are read through the lenses of an implicit and quite possibly unrecognized safety ethic, imagination is being constrained by survival needs. And that deficit of imagination is not going to be fixed by taking the right seminary class. Now, to my mind, two things are needed. First, from a congregational standpoint, we need a vision of marriage and family ministry that understands the role that parents play in the moral development of their children. And that's not just drilling kids on Bible verses or teaching them rules and principles of behavior, as important as those might be. It's helping parents and all the adults within the community to learn an attentive listening stance toward children, the better to foster the pro-social moral emotions that should characterize a community of neighborliness. And second, and importantly, that vision needs to be organically related to a shared narrative in which we as God's people know ourselves to be living in the presence of a God who still speaks, who still calls to relationship, to conversation, and to imagination. It's already an Old Testament theme as I read it that adults carry the stories of the community and must repeat them to their children. And as they do so, they remain in a listening stance towards God and toward their children both, open to the twists and the turns of the story. One hopes that the listening of one generation will encourage the listening of the next, and that together the generations can form a just and loving community that keeps listening attentively, always attentively, for the voice of God who summons.